All right. Thank you for joining me for the final session in the TriNetX Summer Bootcamp for 2026 at the University of California, Riverside School of Medicine. I am Daniel Novak, and I am presenting week 6 posters, manuscripts, and writing tools. And we're going to talk about some of the um, ways you can get that last mile in your paper from your analysis. So let's review where we are. I am Daniel Novak. I exist. I'm here at the School of Medicine as of 2026. And I do a lot of work with our students here related to data analysis and developing their research programs. You can see we've made it pretty far along the way so far, and we are getting closer to the end of our series. We've made it through most of our major objectives, and we are now in some of the kind of wrap up components, but things that are going to really hopefully make your life a little easier. Talk about exporting your data, how to structure literature review, review of a good TriNetX study, and some next gen tools that will help you along your way. So, one thing about TriNetX, at least we don't support students taking data off the platform at present. Your institution might if you're not at UCR, but because we do get people from around the world watching these videos. Um, but there are a couple of things you can export out of the platform that can make your life easier. So once you've completed your analysis, here you can see my final statins, and we used ibuprofen for one version of this as a control group. And we want to export this uh, into a format that we can archive and we can hold on to. TriNetX helps with that. Now, one reason that this is useful is um, to export your data is your findings is that TriNetX changes. It's kind of like the ocean, right? The water is changing all the time and moving around. So this allows you to kind of create a snapshot that will enable you to get through your publications with all your data and all your numbers intact. So when you hit that export button at the top of your analysis at most of the TriNetX screens, certainly in the compare outcome screens, you'll be able to export your propensity score matching and each outcome as a table and a graph of like an image file, a PNG. And you can select some of the outcomes, unselect some of them if you prefer to download just a few. Like maybe you ran some extra ones and you're just finding mortality isn't really showing you any useful outcomes for it. So you can just uncheck those and leave them out of your report. But you'll get two options. The first is to export it as a zip file. And the zip file is going to export all of these CSV files, which are basically just uh, big Excel spreadsheets, right? Flat Excel spreadsheets. Um, it's going to output those into formats that are going to be easy for you to copy and paste into other kinds of tables later on. But I've created some tools that will really help make these more useful than before. You'll also see that at the top of that, for example, is a file. At the top of these zip files is a file called the baseline patient characteristics. And that's your propensity score matching table. So you'll want to make sure you are able to locate that pretty easily because it's very important to many parts of your study later on. Um, you can also, though, in addition to downloading all of your data files as outcomes, as Excel sheets, you can also choose a Word format. Now, this format I recommend because it really makes it easy to send your results around to mentors and partners. It takes a good snapshot of all of the components of your study in a really nice, clear way. And you can archive them. And so if you ever get any questions from anybody about your numbers, let's say 10 years in the future from your study, people ask you questions about it, you can refer back to TriNetX as it was when you saved your results. And that can really help with that. So um, it also helps because then you don't really have to keep going back to the website every single time you want to check your numbers or check out your structure. Um, what's included in the Word doc when you output it? It outputs all criteria for your cohorts, your demographics, your diagnoses, your labs, your medications, and it outputs the logic for them as well. So you can see you must have this, the demographics and age at least 45 years old in the most recent occurrence, and cannot have heart failure or cerebral infarction. And it keeps all of the ICD-10 codes nice and orderly for you as well. Um, It'll also output your risk analysis tables, which you'll recognize from your compare outcomes analysis that we talked about last week, into these kind of nice little Word formats here that you can manipulate a little more easily and copy and paste into other tables. Um, Appendix A through C also preserves your recipe for your analysis and your critique. So if somebody emails you and says, "Hey, we really liked your study, but we need some more details about how you set up your cohorts," you can send them Appendix A through C, and they should be able to mostly reconstruct your analysis just solely based on this set of tables. Um, it also helps because you can put these Word files into AI tools, and with prompts like what are on screen, you can have it do things like review the following omnibus output of a TriNetX study and extract all the outcomes and then put them into a table listing yada, 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 right? All the different components that you're going to want. I wrote this prompt so that if you want to try to use this with your AI chat bot of choice, it could probably help you get your findings out of your paper and into a nice, manageable, presentable table pretty quickly. And you can give it some additional instructions I have written here for you as well. Um, this is also super useful. So let's say you write up your whole paper and you meet with somebody and they give you some feedback and you're like, oh man, I have to go back and change all of my analyses. Well, AI can help you also go back and have it based on these Word document outputs. Um, Update all of the numbers in your paper uniformly so you don't wind up in situations where your abstract says one set of numbers and your discussion section says another and your analysis says another. You don't want that for the sake of consistency, and reviewers will probably catch that. So you can use AI tools to help with that as well. So one additional use for these files, I'm going to show you really quickly on my computer. When you download for example, this is kind of my main analysis from my study. You can say it came in as main analysis.zip, right? And it has all of, I'll just show you the internal structure of one of these zip files. The thing I want to show you is understanding that, developing these tables and all that kind of stuff is really, it's not deep intellectual work, but it's essential to get it right. So I made you guys out there a tool. It's called the TriNetX Publication Toolkit um, to try to help you make sure that your studies are good quality and that they're accurate and that you are outputting your files into good formats that are presentable. One common thing I see with students, and we'll talk about this a little later as well, is um, that you guys often copy and paste stuff right out of TriNetX. Don't do that. It's unpublishable. It looks unprofessional. TriNetX's system is amazing for its ability to output these data reliably and in a nice format, but they're not meant, and the TriNetX folks will tell you this as well, for final publishable prints in your manuscript. So the TriNetX people provide us with the data necessary to actually do that. So what I'm going to do here is show you a couple of the tools that we have here that I've developed for you guys. Some of which are data-based and informational, and some of which are a little more graphic designy. And we'll talk about these in a second. The first thing I want to show you is a calculator tool, kind of a summary calculator tool that I developed for you. And you can use this tool. Basically, you can take the table, any of the results from your study are going to have a measures of association table in a CSV file format that you can use. And you can drag and drop it right in here. And this calculator will review your findings for this from this table and give you a series of really important numbers. So it'll give you an analysis of the power with a brief summary of what that looks like. Number needed to harm or number needed to treat. A e-value sensitivity, which is a really useful number that can help you understand whether your how much um, an unmeasured confounder would have to be in order to unsettle your data. So that's a pretty useful tool that I think you can use. You can drag and drop multiple findings in here, and it'll compute them for you, and you can switch between them pretty easily. It also gives you a little narrative report that you can add to your manuscript once you verify that it's correct. And it has some notes on methodology. So please consider including some of this information in your study to improve the quality of your analysis. I also want to call attention to the Kaplan-Meier survival curve developer that I made for you guys. Now, this should take your outcome result Kaplan-Meier table data. I'm sorry, not your table data, your graph data here, and anything that says kmgraph.csv, you should be able to drop into this directory, and it'll give you some additional options over here on the left-hand side, including colors and titles for your axes and things like that. But it'll allow you to redraw your Kaplan-Meier survival curves in formats that will be acceptable to a journal. One advantage to this over just copying and pasting the TriNetX Kaplan-Meier analysis, which I do not recommend, is you can do stuff like reset the y-axis to give you kind of a zoom in on stuff. And you can see here, zooming in much closer to the top of the scale allows us to see where these data start to deviate. It's not that much in this particular graph instance, but it's pretty useful. A couple other things that this platform, that this grapher does that TriNetX doesn't natively do that you might find really useful is it adds 95% confidence interval error bars here as well. So let me just zoom in on this, see if I can get you guys a little closer view. We're going to go up to like 98% for this particular one. Okay, here you can see that those 95% confidence error bars allow you to see how much of an overlap there are between the two cohorts at different time points. And let's say you want to publish this in a journal where black and white is required, you can do that. You can also set it to a smaller number of days, for example, 5,000 days instead. And you can edit and crop your graph a little more directly if that's more relevant to your study. So this is the Kaplan-Meier survival curve tool. If you take your measures of association tables, I'm going to grab two of them here. Measures of association table for outcomes 1 and 2. You can use the forest plot generator I've created to automatically generate a nice little forest plot for your study. And these look really good on posters and on papers. They show your 95% confidence intervals here like this, and they show your central values here like this. So that's really nice for being able to visually communicate your outcomes to people really quickly. You can change the numbers, so you might say Alzheimer's disease, and then this one is other dementias, right? And when you change the title here, the text here, it automatically changes it in the diagram as well. And there's tons of different visual controls. You can change the color, you can change the marker size, you can specify the x-axis manually if you want, between 1 and 5 or whatever. You can do all sorts of cool stuff that will make your project look really, really sharp. I also had students request similarly for a bar graph maker. I feel like this is pretty easy to do in Excel, but hey, whatever, students ask me for this. So you can use this tool to help with your creating bar graphs as well, and you can adjust the distances between these and things. For propensity score matching, it can be, let me show you first. I created for you guys a propensity score matching. I'm going to go here and get my baseline patient characteristics Excel sheet that I downloaded from my TriNetX thing. I'm going to put it in here. And what you're going to see is it's going to import that sheet and make a really nice little clean table that I can copy and paste right into my manuscript. And one reason I think this is really useful for you all is if you go back and you make multiple changes to your analysis, changing all of these numbers and getting them all right across all of your analyses is really hard. And this table here will do a very good job of communicating to the reader all of the important components. And there's lots of different, you can include p-values if you want, or you can not include them, and you can change the decimals and all sorts of stuff like that that can be useful. Now, that's great for a manuscript, but those tables can be kind of hard to read on a poster. So you can use your exact same baseline patient characteristic, and you can use the love plot generator to create these love plots. And what this does basically is show people before matching and after matching. Uh, before matching, there was a lot of statistical significant standardized mean difference between the propensity score matching values in your analysis. But after matching, you can see they all kind of gravitate towards this line here, 0.0, and almost all of them, except for this header row that really I would recommend taking out. In fact, I even have I believe there's a box in here that will um, take out um, those values. Oh, I thought there was one. In any case, you can use that to delete that, or you can delete them directly from the table. But what's really great about this visualization is it really communicates clearly to people that before matching, there's a lot of statistically significant differences between the groups, and after matching, they're kind of randomized down at zero. They're much below zero point 0.1, which is the threshold that we want for a standardized mean difference. And one nice thing too is this calculator will automatically generate for you a little sentence summarizing your pre and post matching success. How many covariates were above or below, your threshold before and after. So that's really useful stuff. I also have more journals are requesting strobe self-assessments, and I think this is a really important process to look at when you're developing your paper. Strobe is a standardized reporting outcome for observational studies, and you can use this to make sure that you are producing the highest possible quality analysis. So when you submit it to a journal, it's a good use of their time to review, and you've done everything that they expect. You can also, again, use, I want to call attention to this outcome generator where you can use your outcomes from, let's say I'm going to take my measures of association table 1 outcomes there and my measures of association table outcomes for 2. You can drop these in here. And instead of having to manually create your outcomes tables, this will, just like the propensity score match tool, automatically create for you a really nice clean table that you can paste into your manuscript with accurate values every time. Um, Last thing I want to call attention to is multiple comparisons calculator. If you find yourself doing a lot of comparisons in your study, you may need to conduct a correction on your analysis for every, if you have a 5% chance of a false positive in any given study, you're probably going to want to um, adjust that to make sure that you're making it harder to clear that hurdle. So bone-friendly corrections are one way to do that. I strongly recommend reading about this methodology, but this calculator, if you drop in your outcomes, will help you create your new p-value so that you'll know whether your data are still statistically significant. So that's a little bit of the updates on the TriNetX publication toolkit. I'm continuing to refine this tool, and I'll be publishing a paper about it in a couple of months with some folks in the journal, a special edition of a journal. So, with that said, you can contact me anytime, and I'm happy to help you use it to advance your study. Okay. Next up, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about how to structure a literature review. This is something that comes up a lot with my students, and I wanted to close out some of our discussions today with it because it's really important. Doing poor quality literature reviews is one of the number one causes of poor quality TriNetX studies. The other one is just trying to hack for a p-value, but this is kind of one of the top issues. So I want to take you through how to use how to do a literature review in a really good way so that you can use all the tools at your disposal, AI, your clinical colleagues, whatever, to help you make sure that your literature review is in good shape and is going to inform the discussion in a discipline very effectively. So a literature review, just to remind you, has 5 parts really. It's usually about 1,500 words, absolute maximum in a study. In most papers, it's closer to the order of 750 words max. So the first part of your study is going to cover roughly why and who cares for about 250 words. This is going to establish the clinical and human dimensions of why you're doing your study. And I think that's really important. Your next 500 words is going to cover what do we already know. And the 250 words after that's going to cover the most important part for our purposes, which is where is the gap? What is the gap that's necessitating that your study be conducted? And why is your project the right one to fill that gap, right? There are lots of different people out there and lots of different studies that could be used to answer your research question. Why is specifically TriNetX the right tool to use to do that? There's also a fifth part that I'm going to remind folks about, which this is actually comes towards the end of your paper and your discussion, where you're going to loop back around and remind people and tie your research findings back to the big body of literature out there that you're trying to connect to. Let me take you through an example of a paper that does this pretty well. Their findings are very janky. They worked really hard on it, I think, but they definitely um, have their 95% confidence intervals are gigantic because the pools of people are very poor, are very small. Pediatric GLP-1 users are very, very niche as a population. So, what I might suggest and think about that is being critical of their analysis, but let's look at how a really good paper is constructed. So let's look at their review. Their review is highly economical. Most journals cap words between 2,500 to 3,000 words, and this is less than one page, about 500 words, give or take, in this journal to establish why this study needs to be done and what the purpose of it is. So again, the why and who cares is usually part of the introduction section in a journal. Um, because I wanted to do it, or I think it's important, or it's cool, or no, even if no one's done it before, why, right? Why is this a compelling rationale for why the journal should give you really valuable page space or digital space, right? Attention space. Editors routinely reject submissions because they're unclear about why the study was necessary, and that's a huge problem. So this study, the one on pediatric GLP-1 users, has a really compelling reason, and they make it very clear in the first page. Suicide is the second most prevalent cause of death in youth, which is really sad, and 18% of high school students report suicidal ideations. Pediatric obesity is associated with an increased risk for both depression and suicidality. So GLP-1 uh, data, or sorry, GLP-1 drugs are increasingly used to ameliorate obesity in adolescents, and there's a timely need to investigate these associations. So they make very clear the potential human costs of uh, dealing with or not dealing with this issue. So. Why and who cares? Covered pretty well in the course of their literature review. Part two, what do we already know? Well, this is about 500 words, and this is what most of us think of as part of the literature review, but it's really only part of the story, right? It's a summary of existing research that is relevant to your current study. We don't need to know usually about global, obesity epidemics, right? We're aware of that. You can just touch on that, cite one study, and move on. What's really important is why your study, why this existing literature needs your study. So, for example, in our Alzheimer's and statins paper, we realized that while there were several meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials and several meta-analyses of um, observational studies, those two groups of analyses didn't comport with each other, right? The methodology itself has a difference in it that depending on which method you consult, you would wind up at very different places. So we reviewed those studies as well as existing large scale, both observational and randomized control studies to discuss why our study in TriNetX needed to be done. And I think that's something that I want to see people do more of in their life. You don't have to include every article ever written on the subject. Though I'm currently writing a study where we have something like 75 studies we're citing because we did consult as broad a literature as we possibly could to develop, in this case, a survey instrument. And the main goal is not to, again, not to educate people about all of medical science. It's to establish why your paper is necessary. So I'm going to reiterate that. And you got 500 words for it. So This study does a really economical job. You can see here, I just want to zoom in on this because this is something I see as a common problem when people are writing up their TriNetX studies, or even just when medical student beginners are doing it, is an attempt in a lot of these studies in a lot of these literature reviews, to summarize a whole series of different studies and just tell the reader what each study found. And that's not really what you're trying to do. What you're going to try to do here is something more like this. Look at this sentence, right? Adjuvant anti-obesity pharmacotherapy, particularly with glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonist, GLP-1R, has proven to be effective in achieving meaningful and durable weight reduction as well as metabolic improvement in adolescents with obesity. 5, 13, 14. You can see they're using multiple sources to support this claim here. And that's something that you can do as well, right? So it's a good way if you do feel like you want to inform your reader about a broad range of studies that are connected to your paper. You can still do that, but you don't have to cite and provide the outcomes for each of those. You can just connect them to your paper. You can see over here they've done a similar trick, right? While some studies in adults suggest that GLP-1R they have protective effects against depression, 16 through 20. They didn't have to give you each one of those. They gave you the big picture and then they move on to more detailed discussions in other parts of it. So, summarizing research economically, you do not have to summarize each paper or study unless doing so proves a point about your study. As I said earlier, there's one where they specifically pull that one out in this paper. And then you can see here the counterexample that I just highlighted for you, where they highlight multiple papers in one chunk and then just keep moving. This sentence has 5 different papers, 7 citations in one study alone. All right. So again, in your study, you're going to have to identify in your literature review, where is the gap? What is the point of this? Unless you're conducting a replication study, you should really avoid generally repeating existing studies. Now, there can be a lot of value in using TriNetX to replicate existing randomized controlled trials or other things, other kinds of observational studies, because it is a large pool of electronic health records data. And if you did a really good job of replicating that study, and given all of the limitations of electronic health records data and the TriNetX platform, all that stuff, and you did still find credibly that there were differences from the original study, that could be valuable for people, right? But that's different than that's a replication study. That's really different than just repeating existing studies because you didn't bother to do a proper literature review. Good news is that almost every study and body of literature has a gap that needs to be filled, and most papers, if you read them carefully, will specifically tell you what they were unable to do with their data or with their analysis. And that gives you a really good place to start. So, gaps in the research tell us where new knowledge needs to be developed based on new frameworks, theories, observation populations, and approaches. And there's a bunch of different types of gaps that they might call out for you in your study. So, evidentiary gaps, you can see I have a couple here. You can review these at your leisure. But knowledge gaps, practical knowledge gaps, methodological gaps, like I identified in our study, empirical gaps, and theoretical gaps, and population gaps. So, understudied Latino populations, for example. In this study, the GLP-1 and adolescent depression, they're very clear. To our knowledge, the association between GLP-1R treatment and suicidal ideation or attempts in adolescence with obesity has not been directly investigated to date. And they place this actually in their discussion section, but you could just as well place this in your opening part to describe that, they hedged it with, to our knowledge. You should really thoroughly be certain that there are no similar studies out there. Um, but that's really the most important thing to assure people of. And then they also are very clear about why their project is the right one to fill that gap. While most clinical trials commonly exclude participants with a history of suicidal behavior, which is part of randomized controlled trials, right? That's a potential confounder, right? Propensity score matching allowed them to include and match individuals based on their past psychiatric diagnoses. So using that statistical method, this group of people used still included those people in there because it's a mediator that's relevant to their analysis. And again, they placed this in their strengths and limitations section, but it could go in the literature review just as well. As I was saying, there's a bonus round, right? Along with your results, the discussion section of an article is the most important, right? All the methods, analysis, and methods, results, and discussion are the most important sections of your paper. The literature review is actually kind of secondary. It's important you have to do a good quality literature review before you start, but in terms of the importance to the overall paper, it's not, the most important thing. Yet people, especially novices, spend the most time on it. It's actually one of the last things you should do is write it up. Doing the reading you have to do up front. But basically, they included in this section a dovetail. They came back and they tied in their findings, that their statistical findings, with existing research to both support some existing research and call into question other dimensions that may be um, not as relevant. And just as a reminder, the results is just your factual reporting on your data, and your discussion is your opinion about what you think it all means. And so this is a good moment in your discussion to go back to the research and reconnect your findings very clearly. So this discussion, though, contains another 20 citations supporting their interpretation and analysis. So you can see that the study ends somewhere in the 40s, but in terms of their citations, but the literature review stops including papers around 23. And you can see here, this paper ends with around 43 citations or more. So again, this usually comes later after you've run your analysis, but you can find it going on here. From this article, you can see that they went really specifically and they tied it back to four or more different factors that could explain their findings that are already established in the research and support their study. And that is supposed to help us be more certain that their findings are real and not illusory or trash. So that's a little bit about how to put together a good literature review. That's very similar to what I teach in my class, and I think it's very important. But I think it's a really good idea to be very deliberate about developing this as you're developing your manuscripts for your TriNetX projects. Poor quality literature reviews give a bad impression to reviewers and editors. And while not specifically the reason studies get rejected all the time, it is something really important to bear in mind. Okay, let's talk about some next gen tools to help you out with this, though. These would have been really nice when I was in school, though, to be fair, AI actually is kind of a mixed bag. Doing some of this stuff by hand in the old days really forced you to read and peruse and think a lot about your research. But let's talk about some of them. So we have ChatGPT. I'm going to use that as an example, and some other AI tools. And we're going to talk about Research Rabbit really briefly, which is a network database tool. This is, I've included this little analogy for a long time. I first found ChatGPT in around November of 2022, December of 2022, when it was very early on, and people were like, weird chatbots. Maybe they're alive. We don't know, right? And when I first got access to it, I remember it was like the middle of the night. I got, an email like, hey, you can now access ChatGPT 3. I was like, oh, that's really cool. Let me go see if I can use this thing to do a literature review for me, right? It's supposed to have read everything on the internet. So let's see, right? I said, write an academic literature review about the importance of medical student research, including citations. And it came up with this whole thing. I was like, oh my gosh, look at all this literature. I didn't read any of this. I didn't know any of these studies were out there. And I read as much as I possibly could about medical student research. I read everything I could find, every study, every nook and cranny of that literature I could find, I was trying to get into, and it found all this stuff that I completely missed. How much of a fool am I? Right? That was my initial impression, as many of you might have had. Look at all these citations. Look at all this stuff. Well, okay, I started plugging them into Google Scholar the next morning, and I was like, oh wow, all of this is fake, right? And this is something that's very well known now, right? We've all seen uh, hallucinations, right? Confabulations, fake citations coming out of ChatGPT. And the researchers who developed these technologies are still not 100% sure why it's doing it. It could be that the statistical weight of trying to give you the answer you want outweighs its decision to provide accurate information. So it's less of a problem today, but it's still an issue. And you can say to it, well, wait, none of these citations are real. Go, oh, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And it'll go and fix it for you. This actually happened to be where I developed a whole report, and a number of the citations in there were fake. And I had to go through and use more of my Claude tokens to have it do find more correct citations and correct all those citations. For that reason, When I'm doing anything important, I tend to gravitate towards Perplexity.ai because they seem to have developed a way to keep the audit trail, the kind of summary of where it's pulling this information from when it's giving you these summaries a little more honest. So it'll tell you exactly what studies it's citing, and you can go and read them yourself and determine if they're effective. These are real citations, right? So hypertension and breast cancer in Asian patients, right? Well, it has a analysis here that we could really go and read and determine if those findings comport with its summary. So I just want to give you some rules of thumb as you're using AI. I'm an AI proponent. I'm on like 5 different AI committees and I do my own research into AI and scholarship and all sorts of stuff. But I would say if you use ChatGPT or Perplexity to help you compose some subsection of your literature review, please put a note at the top of your paper saying so for my class, or journals increasingly have declarations that you have to include in your study. I would strongly recommend for your own sake that you check every fact that comes out of ChatGPT and check every citation it gives you, check to make sure that the articles it cites actually say what the article says it says. You're responsible ultimately for the accuracy of the paper, not ChatGPT, because your name is on it, and that means something. Use it to defeat the tyranny of the blank page, but beware, right? You can get it. Sometimes you can even ask it, help me structure a literature review to help me with this part of my study. What are the sections I would need to do? What are the main areas in these areas of research that I should cover and include in relationship to my study? It can help you with writing planning and all sorts of stuff, but ultimately you have to ride on it really, really, really carefully. Tools that are advanced but are less fraught are graph databases. So there's two here that LitMaps is one you pay for, and Research Rabbit is one that has a free version. And these tools basically help you get to the next generation of Google Scholar, right? I love Google Scholar. I use it for everything, but there's just sometimes so many um, subsections and subsections and subsections of Google Scholar's search areas, and can be really frustrating to find everything. So graph databases can help you create a visualization of the existing research and see where papers, for example, are cited that you maybe didn't find originally, or it can help you find related studies by authors that were done later on. All sorts of really useful, important stuff that you can use. And Research Rabbit, they changed the interface and made it worse, but you can select a paper and have it find additional papers using the graph database until you've gotten everything you want. And then you can use Zotero, which I really recommend. I don't know, it's freeware, but it has a really nice ecosystem that imports back and forth between Zotero and Research Rabbit, so that when you add things in Research Rabbit, it adds them to Zotero, and then you can easily go from Zotero into your paper for your analysis. So one process for doing rapid literature reviews is to use Google Scholar and Perplexity to identify your initial pool of studies. Use Zotero to organize the studies in PDFs. Use Research Rabbit to import your Zotero and find more relevant studies. Write your sections of the literature review, analyze your data, and use the sources from your original review to contextualize your findings in the discussion section. I might also suggest that as you wind up with more and more and more studies, you can use AI to help you organize them into logical subsections and to make your paper more readable and easier to navigate for the reader. That's kind of a really good way to do it. I also recommend these technologies change all the time, but DeepSeek is one that came out, about 18 months ago or a year ago. That's been very interesting. One thing I like about it, some of the other tools are a little better at this now too, including Claude, about telling you about their thought process. But just this example on here was a question we had about rates of prostaglandins and cesarean sections. And we are trying to understand, should we um, include or exclude certain people in order to get a more accurate result? And it did a very good job of walking us through the process. It identified in its reasoning process a really exactly what the issue that I had thought I was confronting, and then also provided additional kind of expert guidance on it that I thought was very, very valuable. So I recommend considering DeepSeek as well. And you can see it's a really smart kind of friend, right? And it said users worried that if one cohort, probably the prostaglandin group, has more preeclampsia, the effect they see might actually be due to preeclampsia rather than prostaglandins. So That's really useful. And then you can critically assess its chain of logic. That actually is exactly one of the things I was worried about. But you can critically assess this chain of logic really easily with this tool. Okay. That's AI. That's the 10-second tour of AI. I tell people these days I'm tired of talking about AI. I want to use it for stuff. So if you have interesting use cases, I want to know what's going on, what kinds of technologies you're using. And right now, I mean, we have an interesting situation where the clinical folks haven't caught up to the technical folks. So we're at a point where there's only a narrow band of people who can give any meaningful or useful AI insight. And we just have to wait for that to grow as the tools get easier to use and more transparent, and as clinicians and physicians and scientists and researchers catch up, you'll see more interesting stuff happening with AI. But I want to talk about representing your data. For those who have never heard of Edward Tufte, he is a famous MIT researcher who did a lot of work on data display. And in fact, he has a really great book that talks about how the Challenger accident, in doing their postmortem, they actually may have made it harder to plan for future uh, space shuttle accidents. This was many, many, many years ago. But PowerPoint itself may have been part of the problem when it came to assessing future data because it's really hard to present detailed data on a PowerPoint slide versus, say, a table in a printout, right? Um, but mindfully using your data can be one of the best ways to establish the validity of your findings. And good data representations have to be honest. This is an example on this page from one of his books. I think I have it on my shelf, Visual Explanations. Sorry, it's Visual Display of Quantitative Information. This is Napoleon's March to Russia. And if you read his description of this, there's like 9 different kinds. There's weather, there's population, there's month, there's the number of people who went there and came back. And this graph he holds up as one of the best graphic representations of data because it just aligns so many different types of data into one place in one uniform way that's legible, that once you understand what's on here, you learn a lot really quickly about what's going on here. And yeah, that's what we want to try to do with our data. Um, so mindful visualizations ask you to think about how you're using your data representation to achieve your communication goals, but don't use representations that increase the viewer's cognitive load. Don't add analytic value that they don't add analytic value compared to say something simple like a table or are hard to read. These two down here are really, really hard to use and hard to think about. Like it's really, really difficult to understand the point being made in this graph. Like, okay, there's so many different little versions. Pie charts are just by their nature not very useful uses of your space. Just create a table, you know, um, or create a smaller graph, like a bar graph or something like that, that can show all of this in a much smaller space. And then you have cool stuff like this one on the right, but they're neat, but they're not actually meaningful. It's really hard to figure out what's going on here at this size on a PowerPoint slide. It's really, really hard to see. So skip pie charts. They're not really that helpful. You look at this one on the right. This is not something you could just report this in a sentence, right? And this one over here on the left, it doesn't, unless this really helps with your analysis, don't waste this much space on both a pie chart and the bar graph that tells you what's in the pie chart. That makes no sense. Just do the bar graph or just do the pie chart. I mean, don't do the pie chart, do the bar graph. Good data representation types, though. Let's talk about this. Think about how to communicate your analysis to your audience in as economical a way as possible. No one representation type is perfect for every type of data. It doesn't work that way. But here are ones you might consider using that are going to be very common. Your bar graphs, your forest plots, which I showed you the TriNetX publication toolkit will help you make, your Kaplan-Meier curves, and tables. Tables are highly, highly efficient ways to organize information, especially if you add in some additional things like color or size or other kinds of relationships. And again, you can use bar charts in the TriNetX publication toolkit that I developed and you can see. You can use these are forest plots. Our new forest plot maker is a lot prettier, but you can see how nice it is to be able to see how much like this 95, the stroke outcome here, the 95% confidence interval, and the diabetes outcome over here. Those are touching right up against zero or against one rather. So there's no difference between these two groups. So it helps to understand how reliable these data are. Kaplan-Meier curves, as I explained earlier, are a really great way to show change over time in terms of population impact. So you can use the TriNetX publication toolkit. And again, like I mentioned earlier, uh, propensity score matching tables can be a really, really economical way to do this in your journal articles. So consider just using the simplest necessary tool for that. So as we close out the boot camp, I just want to share some examples from students presented with their permission. Here's a paper, a poster that was presented and became a letter from one of our students who is now a dermatologist or in dermatology residency. And you can see that they were able to identify some really important disparities between white and Latino patients. We also have some interesting changes or some interesting investigations into psychiatric disorders for children after experiencing cancer. We thought that was a very innovative use of this platform because that's a very, very difficult group of people to study. So we thought that was really cool. This one was presented at the American Heart Association, looking at alteplase and tenecteplase in stroke management. The student was able to use the NIH stroke scale to provide some additional resolution into when these two different drugs are useful. And this student here did a fantastic job. He just presented his final version. We actually gave him an award for it this past year um, for looking at dupilumab and omalizumab in treatment of Black patients with severe asthma. So we found that there not only was a disparity in prescription rates, but that actually had materially worse outcomes for Black patients, which is absolutely something somebody, that physicians should look into and try to ameliorate. Okay, I'm going to dovetail back a little bit to the anatomy of a science poster because you yourself may want to make a poster someday. So let's talk about how a good one's put together. Well, this is the template that I give our students. Pretty straightforward, right? You got your introduction, your methods, your findings, discussions, limitations, future reference, and future research and references. I even have an area now where we make the discussion bigger and we make the references smaller because using QR codes for references is a good idea. Should you find you need it, you can go and download it. But basically, this is roughly 1,200 words is roughly what you're working with. If you want to go and review this breakdown here, this will tell you pretty much how much you can expect to be able to fit into these different areas. No more than a page for some of these, and you generally want to keep your sizes to 24 font if you can. Very large font. And you can see here's one that we did. It's a lot of text on this one, but I think we did do a good job of capturing our findings in a pretty nice way. One of our students presented this at a version of this at the regional conference in Los Angeles last year, and we made some improvements to it, and we adjusted the methods and stuff like that, and reduced the amount of text. So, some final future directions, some final thoughts as we close up for the night, and we close up for this year's boot camp. My goal, and thank you for if you've come along this far, thank you for joining, and I'm down to one person live, so thank you for joining. Our goal here is to reduce the amount of junk, the schlock that's out there. We want to reduce the number of misleading and poor quality TriNetX studies so that we don't wind up poisoning the pool for our future analyses and to make sure that we're doing good quality work. Um, I know that there's a rich, rich future in continued analyses out there because there's a data set out there called the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System that is not clinical. It is purely epidemiological injury data focused on common consumer goods. There are thousands and thousands of these. There's over 5,000 studies out there using the NEISS data. And if you get creative, you can find innovative ways to use TriNetX. And I think there's many more thousands of papers out there for us to do as well. Another thing that I might point out is a lot of medical students develop case reports. Case reports are single patient studies that provide really detailed information about how a specific clinical situation was managed. But there's a lot of questions about their utility and their validity. Like there are 60,000 cases published every year across all specialties. That's a lot of unique situations, right? So you might want to consider how you can and there's over 200 case report journals across all specialties, by the way. So there's lots of venues that are willing to take these 60,000 studies, but are they just academic litter that just fills up the landscape with really unclear reports of variable quality? Or can we use these as the basis for TriNetX studies to determine how rare certain courses of treatment and certain disease progressions are? And I think that that's a really cool way to do things, where we might have a future genre of study where you start out with a case report and then build that into a TriNetX analysis that helps to investigate how rare are the cases that you observed, what percentage of them are dispatched in the way you observed, how frequently do they experience complications, and what happens years and years down the line from your case. Um, Another thing you might consider doing is mining meta-analyses and systematic reviews, because more and more of them are released each year, as medical students especially seem to think that's a very easy way to get a publication. Having done them, I do not think that they're very easy to do. And though variable in quality, there's a lot of them that are useful in identifying important limitations and new directions in studies. I've talked about this before in the context of our study on Alzheimer's and statins. And many prospective studies are just too expensive to replicate or redo. And TriNetX might be able to shine some light on some of the issues that the meta-analyses find, especially missing data or poor quality analyses. So meta-analyses might be a really rich source of future questions, and I think they're a great way, going back and mining them might be a great way to help continue making sure we're using this bountiful platform in the most efficient ways possible. So that's it. We are done. That is the end. It is me. I am he. This is Daniel Novak, PhD, signing off from the UCR School of Medicine in at the end of June 2026. If you're a medical student at UCR, I'm here to serve you. You can contact me and make appointments with me and see how everything's going. And I want to thank you for joining me on this adventure. See you out there in the internets and in class. Have a great summer. I'm going to stop the recording and talk to our folks here on site. So I'm going to, there we go. Stop.